Okay. How are you? Welcome to Super Bowl Sunday. No, I'm just kidding. This is a different place. So, again, it's Gwen and Aisha here for Just Talking. And today we're just having a talk. We're continuing with our Death and Dying series that will last the whole month. And today we are talking about grief because that's the big G. That's the one that most people associate with death and dying. And, the one thing, this is the one thing that I know, like by the time it got to my mom and my dad or my inner circle passing away, somebody that mattered. Like when I can remember when my father passed away, one of the nicest things that anybody ever did for me was my friend Carol lovingly pushed her way into my world because I just wanted to close the door and melt into that sea of emotion. And she cleaned my dishes for me. She cleaned up my house. That was so, because I didn't have to think about it and I could just sit and wallow. So that's the one thing that I know, experience with grief, allowing those overwhelming emotions to come and have their say, is really something. It's hard to do, right? It's really hard to do, but that's also where I know there was another friend of mine at her father's funeral. I just got her a little plate of some sandwiches to make sure she ate. And it's those small things that are really the ultimate kindness, because you're just not thinking at all, right? So now, the one thing that I'm grateful for is the fact that in our family, we did experience death from a young age. So because of that, our view of it, like we weren't allowed to wear black because you're celebrating. It came from the Scottish Irish background, as I explained the last time. So it was a celebration of what that person brought to our lives, a celebration of what they meant for us. So a lot of times it's telling stories that made you laugh, or, processing the fact, especially with the parent, sometimes you can make them seem a lot nicer than they were in real life. But again, I just hope, for me, it's again, having that experience where it was sort of talked about, the emotional impact wasn't talked about, but the process was talked about. So it wasn't a big surprise. So that's influenced me. And I know, Aisha, you have some really interesting points on this from your experience, right? So do tell.
You know what? I wanted to say, first of all, that I love what you just said about those small moments of kindness when people are grieving, because that is really the ultimate, support that we can give people. A lot of people feel uncomfortable when they see other people grieving, and that's because of their own feelings about grief.
Mm-hmm.
And then whatever the social constructs are around, well, I don't want to, I don't want to interfere. I don't want to get, it's their private time, stuff like that, and I think that there's a certain element of people not being sure about how they can engage with people who are grieving. And I think exactly what you said, which is to do the little things with them and for them, is the best way to just be there and to be supportive. And you don't even have to say very much, just even your presence there to say, be where you are, do what you need to do. I'm here for you, and I'll give you whatever you need, right? So that's really important. So thank you very much for sharing that. I think that's really important. I was going to just touch on those of us who have some kind of trauma and how we deal with grief, because when you've experienced trauma, and I've heard this from more than one trauma survivor, is that you have a kind of skewed view of death, I think. So I can speak for myself, and what I can say is that when you come from trauma, there is, for some people, there is, and I can speak for myself when I say this, there is kind of a fear that that you're never going to get to that place where you're going to be fully happy. You're never going to get to that place where you are whole and where you can where you can say, my life is complete, I'm living happily, you're always waiting for the other shoe to drop. You're always waiting for the next bad thing to happen. And I know it's interesting, even like something that I noticed for myself was body posture. I didn't realize how much I did this, or how much I was just bracing for the next hit of whatever was going to come, you know?
Mm.
And so when you're living like that, you also have this kind of sense that you're going to die soon anyway. Like, why invest yourself in anything, right? Like, why
Mhm.
invest yourself in relationships? You're always kind of with one foot out the door. You're like, you know what? I'm going to die anyway. Why should I do this, or why should I do that? So I feel like, um, some of us with trauma, we have a skewed view of death, and we also have a skewed view of grief, because we're carrying the anticipation of loss with us every single day, and it impacts the ways that we experience life, you know. So I can't thank you enough for this gift of doing this month of exploring death and dying, because um, I've been doing some reading, and I've been watching some documentaries and things like that, and it's really helping me to kind of open up and think about how I think about not just death, but how I think about living,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Because I think that's it. I mean, you can't think, I don't think, now I'm starting to think that you can't actually think about living if you're not also kind of uh, in a cohort thinking about dying as well, right? So not avoiding or separating those two, but understanding how they flow together, how they integrate. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. Like, as you know, like, and that's interesting because even the way our trauma manifested, although it's somewhat there's, you know, trauma's trauma. It just means that something's happened and you're unable to cope with it when it happens. And that's
Yeah.
a very simplistic view of it, but it's what's happening at the time because I was exactly the opposite, but I think it was because I had so much death, and that allowed me to almost to get a view of life that it was like, okay, well, this is their death, so the one thing I'm going to do is if I see you and I say I love you every time and I say that, everybody knows I'm like the gushy mushy, I will hug you, I will love you. And that's because that's one of the things that I said, that it's like, oh, okay. And if, I try to be present, again, I'm not perfect at any of that stuff, but it was only like 6 weeks ago that I realized one of the reasons I couldn't plan things. And I think from a trauma attachment point, kind of attachment style, getting into the whole um, therapeutic effects of what happens with trauma is, I think it's like the abandonment rejection. Like, it's like, well, I don't expect to get any kind of support. So I know I'm on my own. So what's coming next? And that's usually like what's what they call now complex PTSD, right? Is because it's not just one event, it's a number of events. And it's sort of like a big layer cake. But I have to tell you, like, what, 6 weeks ago, I'm 57. And it's like, I was afraid. I wasn't afraid of death, not in that way. I knew it was coming. But because of that, yeah, I jumped out of planes. I did scuba diving. I did all this stuff that if you look on, because I can remember when I was being tested for my diagnosis, the way that they would phrase the questions are like, are you doing things that could be life threatening, or, could seem like I was trying to be self-harming in ways. And it's like, I guess for me, even when I was dealing with the psychologist at the time, or the psychiatrist, I was like, well, I don't think of dying, but in fact, it's the opposite. It's like, well, what's the worst that can happen? Well, let's see. And then, like, as I've described before here, the night dive was the most amazing thing I ever did. So, the bad part is at 57, I've never actually planned something in my life, like said, I can do this, because I didn't expect to be alive a year from now or 5 years from now. And that's from an adolescent view of the world, which is actually, I mean, everybody talks the 0 to 7, but it's the 10 to 15 that's also really, really crucial in how your brain development is, how your personality, how you deal with things in the world, right? So that was as much as you say, like a shock to me, that it was like, whoa. And I think I'm still dealing with the effects of that, because now it's like, okay, I give you permission to dream. It's like, so it's like, I feel like I'm like a teenager, like, oh, what school do you want to go to? Because I never had those thoughts at that age. So the important thing as well is that one of the things about trauma is there's also grief associated with what that trauma brings, which is
That's right, yeah.
grieving your childhood, grieving
Mhm.
the loss of innocence, which I know that we've talked briefly about that before, the loss of innocence. So when you get grief, when it comes to death and dying, it's almost amplified, because especially if it's somebody that's close to you, or somebody that you don't realize that you're counting on them as much as possible, or maybe you trust them a little bit more than you do other people, that can leave a really big hole. And in a lot of cases, if it's a parent and they were the ones that were like not pleasant to deal with, sometimes you feel that guilt, that it's like, oh, I'm glad they're I'm going to go to hell because of this. Like, do you know what I mean? That it's, anyways, that's my 2 cents about that. I really got off on a tangent again, but, because I think that again, it just brings up any deep emotional thing that we go through, gives us an opportunity to really get into our heart. But we also have to be emotionally prepared to deal with those effects. Does that make
Mm.
sense?
Yeah, I think absolutely it does. And I think too that the thing around trauma and grief is that sometimes we're carrying a lot of grief, and um, as you know, I don't like to use the word trigger as much, but when something happens, then sometimes our grief level is higher than it's higher than it would be normally, right? I can remember that there are a couple of people in my life, good friends that I had, that left my life, and they left in a very kind of abrupt way, and I it was years I could not get over it. I
Mm-hmm.
could not get over it, and I would. We have mutual friends on Facebook, so I would see every once in a while their picture would come up, and then I'd kind of go and see what they were doing, and it's like it's that thing about not being able to release what's not being able to release something in a natural way, in a timely way, in a self-caring way, in a healing way, right? That you're just carrying on, you're carrying on, and you're holding on to that grief
Yeah.
like a like a lead balloon.
Mm-hmm.
You can't let it go. And so it took me also a long time to be able to find some peace with something that you should have not should have, but something that um, had, I think I would say, had overstayed its welcome.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
In terms of grief. And so when you're a trauma survivor and you're holding on to grief, sometimes it's, you don't realize um, what the detriment is to you,
Mm-hmm.
to not be able to process, to not have those tools, to be able to process, to have those skills, to be able to let stuff go. And that is really important because it's all about flow. Even when people pass away, we we have to carry on at some point,
Mm-hmm.
right? We have to continue to live, and there's no time limit. There's nobody that says that you can only grieve for this amount of time.
Yeah.
But when you're in trauma and you're already carrying a lot of sadness and grief, it can be just another thing that you take on that that brings your energy down, that keeps you in that place of trauma response. You know what I mean? Grief response.
Absolutely. And I would just like to, the thing is, in this North American culture that we have, if when a friendship ends and that friend was important to you, And sometimes it can feel like a betrayal. It can feel like, maybe there wasn't, things weren't said. And then all of a sudden one day somebody stopped, and I've had that too, where people that were almost closer to me than family for many years. And then all of a sudden it's like, it comes out of left field and you're like, where did that come from? And then
Yeah.
part of that is you sort of going, okay, is it me? Because as a trauma person, you're still looking at it like, um, you know, oh, what have I done to deserve this? Or
It's
I'm
my,
gonna have to be
yeah,
nicer next time. Or I'm
yeah.
I'm gonna have to, and then you get to that point sometimes where it's like, I can't, like, I know for me personally, um, PMS, thank God for PMS, because
Mm.
sometimes it's like, okay, I can't take this anymore. And you have a
Mhm.
naturally short fuse. And so
Mhm.
it just, um, it gets explosive. Not necessarily violent, but expressive. That it's like, if it's just not the right day, then sometimes I say the wrong thing. But I think it's also really important though that you recognize that you can have a good friend. And if that friendship, as you say, maybe it should have been gone and dealt with a long time ago, but it doesn't mean, it's like when we end relationships as well, it's like, oh, I don't love them anymore. It's like, the opposite of love is not loving. Like, you don't stop loving people. It's that love is just goes elsewhere. So I don't mean like you're still in love with people, but those relationships were still important to you in some way, shape, or form. And so a lot of times, and I've just been listening to the love languages, which I think everybody should be, like, it's just a really interesting premise. And I know I'm coming to that, table quite a few years later. But that's the interesting thing, is that if the person we're with isn't speaking the same way, it's even the men are from Mars, women are from Venus, or for whatever reason we speak to each other in different ways. So part of that is you're grieving an idea of something, right? So that can be, you were in a job that you thought was secure well, nothing's secure. Like, that's all in our head, which is one of the reasons why there's a lot of grief going on right now, because you never really actually know what's going to go on tomorrow. You just think you do. We have plans, and it's nice to make plans, but it's also nice to be able to understand that you have every single right to feel sad because that friend ghosted you, or that relationship didn't end, or didn't ended. And those emotions, as you say, there's no time limit, but you need to be able to give yourself the space to be able to feel all that stuff and it's not gonna, I mean, God, this is 4 years later. And last week I had my nanny, I had this big grief pocket that came out of nowhere. And it was, when was that, Friday? Did I talk about that last week?
I don't
I
think so.
don't
No.
think I did. But it was, yeah, no, that happened this week, where there was two people in two different places on Zoom, and these people just reminded me of this woman that was very important to me. And I just ended up completely losing it. And the good thing is that there's been this pocket of grief. Like, I've always felt like it's not, when you have those really good cries and you know that your heart's just cleansed. I
Mm.
had what I thought, but it really wasn't. And this was it. This was that, oh, oh. And then you just, when you do that, you just feel your heart open a little bit more. You know what I mean? But it takes courage to sit in that, and just let it come.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Um, I feel like, I feel like this is something that we should teach in schools. I think this is something that we should talk about. I really, more and more, I'm feeling like, I shared last week the story of my grandmother. And I feel like, for me, what I want to do now in this space where I'm more open and more willing to explore um, what what it was that she meant to me and what our relationship was, that that I would like to have some ritual around that, some kind of ritual to tell her how much I loved her and how important she was to me, and and how my life would have been so different if she hadn't been in it. you know, and I feel like that this thing about ritual, like even with those friends that I lost, if I had the wherewithal, if I had um, the skills to support myself by creating some kind of a ritual, right? Then perhaps I wouldn't have had to carry that grief as long as I did, you know. And also there is a certain element of grief that you experience when something happens that isn't that doesn't have closure.
Mm-hmm.
Like when
Mm-hmm.
people leave
Good
your
point.
life, right? And they don't tell you why, and they don't give you an opportunity to, you know, like you're not really understanding what happened, that they just kind of upped and left. And even if you had an opportunity to sit down with them, you never got an answer that really made sense to you. How do you find closure to your feelings and to your grief, right? Also, sometimes, you know, we're looking for an answer that we're never ever going to get,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? So people pass away, people leave our lives, and the grief is compounded because we want to know why.
Yep.
And there's sometimes when there's no answer that anyone is going to give you that's going to satisfy that question. And it might be, they might be telling you the absolute truth.
Yep.
They might be saying this is the reason. But you know, in your heart, you're just like, no, I can't accept that. Right. So I think that the skill of this the skill of grieving, or the understanding of how to grieve, I wish that that was something that we taught people in school, children, adults, that we had kind of some kind of place where we could go and we could talk about what it is to grieve and to find closure when there is no closure, right?
Yeah. Oh, I love it. I mean, I don't love it. Obviously, it's painful. But I think again, a recent situation that I had was, the interesting part is, as you know, when you're dealing with any kind of trauma recovery, you have to start by not looking out here and by going in here. Yeah. And saying, this is not them, it's how is it me and how is it my boundaries. So it's really quite like this last, and it was a pretty big one. It's been almost a decade, and I still feel like, so it's been probably 6 years. And this is a person that was like a sister to me. And it's still the biggest thing from the beginning, and this is how you know you're making strides, is because when that conversation happens, and whatever happens, your first thought is like, okay, how do I feel about this? And taking it from, yes, they've hurt me, and oh, you, and taking it here, and then just looking at the content of the conversation that came about, and then looking and going, yeah, but is that the kind of relationship I want? So, right. And so I think that's what you're talking about, like with a ritual, but even if it's a thought process where, you know, because from a whole trauma thing, it's also about boundaries, right? And again, that's why grief, because we can love people that are horribly nasty to us. We can, you know, we can still grieve a relationship that was poison and toxic, right? I mean, that's why, you know, domestic violence, I mean, what we do to people that we care about is horrible as human beings, right? So I think that it's really interesting. And maybe next week we can talk a little bit about the different rituals that people have around death and dying, and maybe some rituals around, because Tracy, again, who's a death doula and a grief specialist, she's going to be on at the end of the month. So we're going to have a conversation with a professional there. But I know that one of the things that we talk about, like one of the rituals, I know when my dad was passing away, because if you look in the Druid or the pagan world, then the West is where you talk to that's the nether regions, that's the next life, or, you know, not of this world. So one of the rituals that I did every night I came home from seeing my dad was I would sit towards the West and I would talk to my ancestors and talk about a good transition. But that's also something that you can do to be able to talk to your grandmother, you know, or to get a night, light a candle, and write a love letter to her, you know, and be able to say it out loud with, you know, respecting. So that's like an example of Marianne Williamson has a whole bunch of specific prayers. And again, that's a Christian based. So, well, not really, you know, sometimes like A Course in Miracles is written in Christian language because that's the language that people were accustomed to. But we can talk about like different rituals that are used in, you know, different ways, different religious aspects. But I know that for me, being able to talk to the West and talk to my ancestors was really powerful for me, for my dad. And I mean, it's been like 8 years now for my dad, and I still have, you know, that's coming up March 17th. It was very nice of him to pass away on such a, you know, a small day that nobody celebrates at all. So, but yet that's also a good opportunity to celebrate, you know, hopefully at some point you'll be able to celebrate that day, you know, so, but you can't get away from it, right? Anyways, I hope that makes sense, but that might be something even that you can start with, because that's ancestors, and that's, I believe that's like, you know, I don't know. I found it powerful. So
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I think that um I think that we I think that it would be good to talk about ritual next week. And I think maybe what we can also talk about is the importance of ritual.
yeah.
Why it's important to have these kinds of rituals, because I don't think we have enough rituals, especially in Western, those of us who are in this kind of Western milieu. We don't really have the kind of rituals that help to go through life. And that's something that could be very valuable, you know, to all of us. And I think that you're right. I think that you find the ritual that makes sense, the ritual that really connects you with your roots, that connects you with your inner guidance and your inner self, and whatever that looks like, to just be able to use it so that you can have that connection with the person that you've lost, whether they're in this life or in a different life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly it. And you know, I love burning stuff. So there's nothing better than writing stuff down and burning that stuff. But anyways, so we're looking forward to next week. I hope your team won tonight, but thank you so much for your honesty and your openness in talking about this and coming to terms. And I'm glad that again, we can do this and provide an opportunity for not only communication, education. I did just post something, if y'all saw, about the medical assistance in death that's coming up here in Canada. And it's very important that you take a look at that. Because anybody that knows, anybody that's been around that, I just find, I know that if I was in a place, and this is the thing that made it easy with my father, is he had like, there's 6 blood vessels that go to the brain, and my dad had 3 strokes at the same time. So he was like, and the great part was they had a lot of people, they had 3 people in the room talking to us as a family on what we were going to do. And it wasn't our choice. We already knew, and we didn't have to make that decision. We just had to honor my dad's wishes. And that really takes the responsibility off those that are living. So this is another thing on not necessarily ritual, but we might get in that 2 weeks from now. But next week, I'm really looking forward to ritual, because there's a lot of ways, eulogies, for instance, things like that.
Oh yeah.
You know, a lot of people, oh, I don't want a big thing. It's like, it's not for you, it's for the people that are living.
That's right.
So
Yes.
we'll get into more about that next week, and how we can help each other grieve and, you know, sit Shiva as the Jewish culture does. You know, we can get into all this stuff. So we look forward to seeing you next week. And thank you again, Aisha. And Aisha's doing a wonderful, do you want to just quickly finish up with your challenge that you've got going right now?
Oh, thank you, lovely. Yeah, I have launched a free expansive leadership challenge, and it's for anyone who is a leader, an aspiring leader, a team lead, just to dig into your leadership skills, to really build more capacity, and to lead compassionately and with balance, with equity, and with inclusion. So you can visit on my website, which is equityandleadership.com, and you can sign up there. It's totally free. It's from now until the end of the year. So you'll be spending quite a lot of time with me, but it's not a big commitment. It's all self-directed. It's all independent with one coaching call every month. So please do, if you're interested, please do join. And I just want to take some time and say thank you to you, Gwenda. And I think what's lovely about this conversation, especially around death and dying, is that we're what we're doing together, and the space that you've created for us to do this is that we're showing how important it is to be able to rely on other people
Mm.
for the things that we're not able to do by ourselves. You know, we always, I think there are a lot of us who think that we should be able to handle it. We need to be able to do it on our own. We don't need any help and all that stuff. But, you know, when you have someone that you trust, that you care about, they care about you, you're invested in them, they're invested in you, and you talk about these things, you make space, and you connect with each other, you share your experiences, it makes everything so much easier. You get so much more clarity, you get so much perspective, you get support, and you create a beautiful bond with someone that deepens every time you have a conversation. So I thank you for that, my beautiful friend. Thank you.
I love you. And we're going to
Love
have
you.
the link to Aisha's challenge is going to be where this is posted at Gwenda Lambert Life Starts Now. And again, we've been up to our eyeballs this week, but we are looking to move this all to a Just Talking page. So it'll have its own page. So we're very excited about that. But yeah, so we'll see you next week where we're going to talk about ritual. And so I'm excited about this because, again, this is sort of my wheelhouse.
Yeah, me too. Me too. It's going to be good. All right. Thank you, lovely. Thank you,
Really,
everyone. Nice to see you.
have a great week, guys. See you next
Have
week.
a good week. See you next week.